Hi there. Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Rhombus Tix, and I'm going to keep on reading to you Chapter 13 of Grenademan vs. the Zombies. Jarvie's visit to Arlington National Cemetery had been a total bust, and Jarvie had wasted one of the precious seeds. Jarvie still seethed at the idea. Chaos obviously had limits, and his idea for an elite group of zombie shock troopers had failed miserably. The seed had just vanished when he had tried to use it. It was like the cemetery had just absorbed it somehow without giving it back anything in return. Thus far, he had 4 kinds of zombies. The snarks were basically just living creatures with their brains turned into zombie matter. He owned them, but they could still act normally. The blood zombies were fast, deadly, and also essentially living. They could spread their infection merely by biting someone. The undead zombies were truly undead, and almost any dead body would do. Some didn't animate, though, and he hadn't figured out why just yet. The fire zombies were intelligent and seemed to require heat, but they also didn't seem to be living creatures either. They could fly and shoot and fire and various other things, but they also seemed pretty fire-resistant. He wanted a 5th type, a soldier. He still couldn't believe it. He'd made a volcano to cause all kinds of dead on Earth to rise, or so he believed. And here he couldn't even raise the dead in a lousy cemetery. If there were limits to his power, why hadn't Chaos bothered to inform him of them? Did he want to lose this? Jarvie certainly didn't want to. Keeping a few seeds in reserve seemed like a good idea, but the zombies weren't really as good as a fighting force. They were pretty mindless, really. Snarks might work, but they were vanishing at an alarming rate. He told them to turn themselves into blood zombies, which kind of reduced his pool. He soon realized that there were elements of his master plan that weren't all that well thought out. But what was he going to do? Consult some kind of manual? Jarvie knew he needed zombies, and he wanted them to be soldiers. After talking to Laura, he knew exactly where to go. The graveyard pulsed and teemed with life. There was rage here, all right. Unanswered rage that would fuel the zombie soldiers Jarvie brought back from the grave. The seed pulsed and then exploded in a starburst of red. There was unfinished business here. One by one, the hands came up through their imprisonment. The bones were laced with ectoplasmic flesh, almost as real as actual flesh and blood. The temporal echo of the blue Civil War uniforms blazed under ash blanket across the sky. They were creatures of gray light and shadow. According to the history brochure, this had been the largest prison camp in the South during the Civil War, and the soldiers buried here had never returned to their homes. One of them walked forward boldly to Jarvie. "Who are you to waken the dead?" it croaked. "I am Jarvie, servant of Chaos. I didn't expect any of you to be able to talk. Are you the men who died?" The soldier shook its head. "I am the spirit of the bones, but not from the bones. Our blood was spilled and has fueled our rage." Jarvie didn't entirely know what he was talking about, but it looked like Laura had been right about this place. He'd have to read up on exactly what happened here. "Good," he said to the zombie. "Will you do my bidding? Our argument is not with your foe, but we are bound to your will. We have no choice, though know we will be watching. We do not serve you willingly, Jarvie the slave master." Jarvie didn't like the sound of that. He was about to dismiss them out of hand when he felt a tyrannical current run through his body. He wasn't sure what it had been at first, and then he realized it was the spirit of the anima. It resonated inside of him in an unseen warning him, telling him in no uncertain terms that Chaos didn't care about Jarvie's cowardice. Jarvie had selected the host, and now he was going to use it. Another seed would not be wasted. The feeling didn't say this with words. Instead, it was just fleeting intuitive impressions that gave him an inkling of what would happen if he didn't use the gifts that Chaos had given him. This also meant that using the 7th seed was out of the question at the moment. He was going to have to go deal with Doc and the others right now. No more delaying for strategic buildup. "Your will is not required, only your cooperation and skill," Jarvie said to the soldier zombie. "I can make you all suffer more if you do not heed my call." There was a moan and a wail of protest as the prisoners began to march in military formation down the road. Jarvie had a zombie army now. He had his apocalypse, and he had his fighting force. They made a brief stop at a nearby military base. The guards that were still left put up a valiant struggle, but Jarvie's zombie soldiers ignored most of the shots fired at them. Unlike the bio-zombies, they were actually dead. Unlike the normal undead zombies, they were fast. Unlike both, they were very, very smart. Once inside, The zombies loaded up with assault rifles, grenades, flamethrowers, and other paraphernalia. They'd learned how to fire the more modern weapons very quickly, and they left the base and began to march forth. As they marched, Jarvie's confidence began to grow. They were within 100 miles of Jerk Central, and all he saw around him was devastation and gloom. There were some survivors, most of whom he had caged and brought behind him. A few shot at the zombie soldiers, but they proved even more difficult to kill than the undead zombies. It was very hard for him to get numbers, but by the end of 2 days he had enough followers that he had to fly up 1,000 feet or more just to see the edges of the mob. What he found fascinating was the way the three kinds seemed to stick together: blood with blood, undead with undead, and soldiers with soldiers. There weren't many snarks left. He had them converted into blood zombies a week ago. Finding food became annoying. Snarks needed food. Fortunately, all the other kinds only cared about human flesh. And he also liked to reserve a nice fresh stock to select for zombies. He never knew which type he might need. The lack of light from the ash cloud had killed a lot of the crops, and they were rotting in the ground. And without snarks, he could only rely on zombie soldiers to go and find food. He certainly wasn't getting it himself. While they seemed to have a natural understanding about how to use weapons, he had to explain things like canned food at least 7 or 8 times before they understood well enough to bring it back, and he had to repeat the instructions exactly each time foragers went out. After a while, he began to suspect this was willful on their part, which made him distrust them all the more. Enslaved undead race were a lot more dangerous than undead hordes of blood or undead zombies to him. On and on they marched, until finally on the 3rd day they came within sight of a town. Jarvie could feel chaos squirming within him. This was the right time and the right place. The final battle would be here, and at least 3 or 4 people he had to kill were inside. Grenademan had remained on the fringes, and he certainly hadn't been able to stop the apocalypse. He didn't really understand why Chaos considered order a threat, but Jarvie was not stupid. If Chaos considered order a threat, then so did Jarvie. Defeating Grenademan was the original idea behind the fire zombies, and he needed commanders. But the seeds worked in large part the way they wanted to. Oh, and they accepted his initial inputs, but once he gave that input, they had a way of twisting to gain a life of their own within those parameters. He was pretty sure it came from his limited understanding of magic, but what mechanic knew everything about every model car that was ever built? He had an idea about how to get some people he could trust, and he suspected a lot of the survivors he had captured would come in handy. People were amazing when they had to do something to survive. He just had to give them a little incentive. Dr. Ozark watched the zombies chase the young woman. She wanted to rush down and save the girl, but was compelled against doing so. This was for 2 reasons. The first, because the limited order she had been given meant she had to find someone worthy, and second, because she wanted to find people who were going to be useful for what she had in mind. The girl ran across to the right, across the field filled with debris. It looked like someone had tried to build an impromptu fort at one time, but whoever it was now long gone. The girl ran up the ramp to the top of the monkey bars. The zombies moved back and forth underneath, and they were unable to shake the bars a bit. But none of them really had the mental faculties to climb them or to work together to rip the playground apart trying to get to her. She moved back and forth like a squirrel, deftly avoiding their grasp while maintaining her balance. The girl kept looking around for a way to leap past them, and at one point she almost looked like she was going to succeed when another pack of zombies showed up and blocked all directions of retreat. She was cornered. Escape became impossible. Back and forth she went. But her death was utterly inevitable now. Ozark spread her wings and soared down, grabbing the girl. The girl naturally screamed in panic, trying to break free. Ozark knew that her fiery flesh was burning the girl, but at the moment there was nothing to be done about it. She dropped the girl onto a nearby rooftop. The girl looked at Ozark a moment and then ran away. So far, Ozark hadn't been able to find anyone worthy by any stretch of the definition. She wanted to find people who were willing to sacrifice themselves to a state like this and then potentially turn against Jarvie at the last minute. But that was proving harder to do than it sounded. With her ability to sense heat, she could pinpoint any living human in a wide area. She knew that this part of the city there were at least several hundred who were still living, and there were tens of thousands of bio-zombies running around. Some of them seemed to be slowly winding down due to lack of food, but most of them were still up and kicking. She couldn't sense the undead zombies at all. When she found people, though, they were almost never alone and were in places that it was very hard to get to. She flew off and continued her search. The refugees were not handling the arrival of an army the day after it had arrived in town very well. At first, they had been incredibly grateful for their rescue, but when they saw the throngs of zombies coming after them, they were quite upset, nearly panicked at first. If it were not for the fact that the people here were so well prepared, they would have been a complete riot. The soldier hadn't told anyone his name. He liked it that way. It helped give him a cushion of unreality to deal with everything. He'd read somewhere in a book once that names were supposed to give people power over you. Without giving them his name, he was just some faceless guy with a gun and combat fatigues who helped people and kept them safe. He'd gone with the refugees for days and just on his duty. He guarded them, but had spoken as little as possible. Without a name, he didn't have to think about the people he'd lost and the promises he hadn't been able to keep. But he didn't forget the names of the people he owed. They were a part of him now, stored in the back of his mind. There was something about the soldiers who were in the army he could relate to. He couldn't say why, but he felt a connection to them, which frightened him. What was wrong with him? There was something unusual about the zombies this time. They'd never marched in nice, neat columns before. Most of them didn't, but he could sense something weird through the binoculars. The dot on his watch told him the sun had gone down, but he couldn't tell that against the black sky. The earth shook as the throng moved forward. How many were there? He couldn't begin to guess, but thought maybe they were thousands, maybe tens of thousands. Certainly more people than there had been inside of the stadium when he'd gone to watch a football game. Several times as many people as lived in his small hometown in Montana. He clutched his assault rifle and prayed about what to do. He didn't get an immediate answer, but he felt that he was who he was, and just because he was something when he looked out at the zombies didn't mean that he was going to betray anyone. He was a good soldier, and he was going to protect these people no matter what. And then there was the voice, almost as if from the heavens, that made the earth shake, and it said, "I only want 3 people. I want Kevin, I want Doc, and I want Beads. Give them to me, and I will leave the rest of you alone. Oscar is dead. Well, he's undead, and on his way here. 1 down, 3 to go." The soldier was pretty sure that wasn't God speaking. The crowd, refugees and townsfolk alike, had gathered against the wall to look at the zombie army. They looked back and forth among themselves, trying to decide what to do. At this point, Momo, apparently the guy in charge, stood up in front of the others and said, "We don't have to have all the answers, folks, but we do know that what is keeping those 3 alive is as important as stopping Jarvie. That's the name of the guy who's given all of us so much misery. Do you want to let him win?" There seemed to be a moment where some of the town were going about to do just that, but then some of the original inhabitants of the town began to chant, "No," over and over. Soon it became infectious. Everyone in the town went along, and the sound of their united voices was greater than the mighty voice Jarvie had used to warn the town. Jarvie cursed. He was tempted to lay siege to the town, but they'd obviously had time to prepare. That was kind of the whole point of the bet, wasn't it? Well, it was time to just see how good their defenses were. The soldiers let out a mighty trumpet blast, and suddenly they began to march forth against a wall of undead before them. Their assault rifles came out, and they launched a hail of lead against the concrete barrier in front of them. Holes began to appear in the wall just as the soldiers didn't even bother to stop their march or pay attention to the counterfire. They just reloaded and kept firing. Then suddenly the barrage stopped. Jarvie was cautious and ordered the soldiers to stop their advance. The town was clearly planning something, and it didn't involve just conserving ammunition. Instinct proved powerful, and he ordered his troops to fall back. After all, it wasn't like he had to worry about their morale. Jarvie's intuition took over too late, though, for just as the zombie soldiers began to retreat, large plastic barrels catapulted over the town in hordes. He checked with his snarks inside of the town. Catapults? They were using catapults? The barrels landed in the zombies' midst and burst open, spreading a fine mist. The zombies caught fire. At first, Jarvie laughed because he thought they were using napalm. That might work on the bio-zombies, but it wasn't going to do anything to the undead. That was when he noticed that the fire was white and had a silver lining. Zombie soldiers and the other undead zombies shrieked with fear and pain and retreated back towards him. Jarvie cursed again. Where the heck had they gotten that much holy water? Did it count if you made industrial-sized vats of it like that? 2 could play at that game. He was going to make some unholy water, and then they'd be joining him. All it took was a few dead people on the other side, and then they'd all be dead. Better yet, he'd build catapults of his own. But first, several snipers attacked him at once, but he ignored them as their bullets bounced harmlessly off his anima shield. Using his anima, he smothered the flames of the retreating soldiers. Much of their ectoplasmic flesh had burned away from the flame. Before, they had seemed like slightly rotted versions of their lively selves, but now their flesh was charred and scarred. They actually looked worse than the regular undead zombies that he'd made at first, but their eyes were glowing a solid red now. They were clearly unhappy, which suited Jarvie just fine. Dr. Ozark slowly walked into the nursing home. It smelled of death, but her senses clearly told her that there were at least 10 people left alive here. She slowly walked up the stairs and burned through a pathetic wooden barricade that someone had made out of tables. That might have stopped undead zombies, but not her. As she entered the hall, someone threw a metal bedpan at her head. If she could feel pain, it would probably have hurt a lot. It mainly hurt her dignity. There were half a dozen people in wheelchairs and 3 more on beds beyond it. A rather healthy-looking nurse lay unconscious on one of the far tables, and a little boy was getting another bedpan ready to throw at her. "Wait." Her voice sounded hollow, as if it came from far away, but it carried a distinct power with it nonetheless. The child dropped the bedpan in surprise. Dr. Ozark raised her hand. "All of you are old, and therefore have seen a lot of life," she said. "This experience clearly makes you qualified for greatness." They looked at her like she was insane. The child picked up another bedpan. Dr. Ozark smiled with her ghastly grin and continued, "I am here to ask if you want to become fire zombies." One of the old men, the one closest to the child, motioned for him to lower the bedpan, and then he looked at her with cobalt blue eyes that bored into her and asked, "Why would we want to do that?" She took another deep breath, even though she didn't need to breathe, and said, "I admit that the necromancer Jarvie has me under his thrall. But what he does not realize is that unlike the other kinds of zombies he has created, I retain my free will. So far, he has only given vague commands that are easy to work around. He must be stopped, and before I can do that, I need to find others who are worthy to be undead commanders of his legions. If you are willing, you could come with me and help fight him. As long as you can avoid his commands, he will be powerless to stop you." The old man looked at her a long time. All of the other people in the room were looking at him. Finally, he nodded. "I've been waiting to bring it back to whoever caused this for months now. If you can give me a body that is strong and capable of getting out of this chair, I'll squish his head." "Are you certain?" Dr. Ozark asked. She wanted to be careful, even though she knew she was desperately wanted them to say yes. "Hell yes, I'm certain," he said, and then he looked at the other old people next to him. "And unless you're stupid, you'll join in. Fat lot of good we're doing here." Ozark counted all 8 of the old ones who had accepted. One by one, she drained the heat from their bodies until they were essentially dead. Then she gave them a bit of fire that burned in her temples and passed it to each. Where there had once been 8 starving, crippled old people, now stood 8 incredibly powerful fire zombies ready to do battle against the force that had thrust all of this upon them. With a roar, she spread her wings and flew down the stairs and into the open sky. There were 8 very righteously angry fire zombies behind her. Momo had been very cautious in his planning. He had put all 3 of the first circle in separate locations inside of the town and placed a number of guards on them, in case Jarvie had some kind of stealth zombies. What he didn't count on was the fact that none of the guards were really expecting a human attack. Around midnight, there was a large scuffle near one of the barracks. Several weapons had been stolen from the armory by some of the refugees who believed Jarvie when he said that all he wanted was those 3. As they crept up into the night, they found the guards outside of Doc's room and shot him in cold blood. Of course, those guards immediately rose as zombies, which gave the conspirators an excuse to sound the general alarm. The internal response teams arrived quickly and began battling the zombies. Of course, since they were responding to zombies, the response teams weren't really paying attention to little things like the lack of guards in front of Doc's residence. In the darkness, they didn't even notice that the zombies they were fighting had been the guards. One by one, the conspirators slipped into the building, while the brave defenders outside tried to put down the zombies. Unfortunately, most of the guard zombies still had their machetes and rifles. While the zombies weren't using the rifles, they certainly seemed capable of using a machete and were more than capable of doing some nasty damage with it. When the defenders started to fall, the response teams had to fall back and regroup until they could bring holy water hoses down to bear. But the fire truck was all the way on the other side of town. They hunkered down and waited.